Commander's Log, January 3, 2403. 2403-13. With the Chimera and half of the Carno and Paris families away on a mission, exploring the Gamma Quadrant, the Starship Emmett Tell, me new posting, has brought us to the most unusual planet, Nepotisia, named for the fallen giant gods of yore. So far, no sign of ancient gods, but there's something far more pressing going on down here. The wedding of two of our crew, Miral and O'Brien, haven't helped them. This is interesting. Why did the Q send us back here, right now? You're asking me. If you try to ruin this, I'll personally find you, so help me. Hey, you three, where'd you come from?
I wonder who invited them.
I have no idea.
By the way, cute wedding. You make a nice couple. Bridezilla over here would have murdered the guests if it wasn't for me. I did wonder who invited Koloth and Cyrano to our wedding. Not me.
What's going on up there?
I wonder who invited them.
I have no idea. Can we talk about the issue now?
Not now, it's a wedding. We can talk about that later.
What? That I'm clearly not an O'Brien. What do you want all pouty about, Lieutenant?
Oh, ignore him, Commander. Enjoy the wedding. Yes, you'll live longer. Dear, the dessert tray is going to topple over. Let the servers worry about it. And Jeremy just looks so uncomfortable.
The tray is not perfect. Ah! Why don't you go help him before he has a panic attack? Me, Dad? What? Oh, Romulan ale should still be illegal. I was assumed it would be Cito and me getting married first.
But it ended up being me and Rutherford here.
I assumed Crass was sweet on you, sir.
Certainly not. Kid, pass the Romulan ale.
Here, knock yourself out.
Well, not just yet.
Commander Boiler here, sir. I can't get through to the ship. Aye, is it a malfunction or something else? The signal check-in did not.
Oh, great. What's going on now?
I can't raise the ship.
Kira to tell. Come in. Priority frequency. Nothing. It's like there's no one up there to respond. Yellow alert.
What's going on up there?
Okay, what's going on? Tell me. I knew it'd turn out badly. I just did. No time to raise a panic. We must assess the anomaly and, if possible, beat the enemy into submission. There's no sign of enemy units anywhere.
Let's go to Riker's house. He'll know what to do.
Well, that's a good idea if he was here.
What's going on up there? Commander, I'm not getting through the ship. We're all down here. Why did we do that? Mahoney to tell. Nog, come in, come in. We can't raise the ship. Is that a malfunction or something else? Not sure, but as of a moment ago, the signal callback went dead. I don't understand. The force field over the house is not a cloaking device. I'm not detecting any sign of there being a house here. How is that possible? Fan out and look for clues. Our equipment's still working. We need to figure out what's going on here. I'm detecting humanoid remains over there.
Did someone get killed?
This place is eerie now. What gives? I'm detecting traces of there being a house here. Only they're old. Very old. That cannot be possible. What is it? The grave site is Riker's, not his ancestors. He died in 2430. How?
How is that possible? Alton Soon and Kal Kat?
I'm his descendant. We pulled you off the planet before the battle. The whole wedding party. Impressive feat, really.
You will return us to our timeline, or I'll see what happens when I slay a Q. Dear, not now. Maybe later.
You two are great, really. I'm an android version of Holocat from your time, many centuries removed. Sooner here is the new guardian of wherever. The anomaly destroyed the planet, so we had to make a new one. Temporary fix, really. How come you look like the Carno? Genetics, maybe? I was of no relation. The point is, you are all no longer in your timeline. The event that would have led to each and every one of you being blown up in a rogue Klingon attack never took place, and it led to a long civil war in your time. If you go back, you may be able to prevent it. But it may be worse here if the anomaly finds us. It might just decimate this planet also. Give me the last of the bottle, Crass. Brass? Where is she?
She wouldn't have run off.
The time stream is whacked. She could have fallen into a space doorway. We will look for her. No telling what Kestra did when she got her powers. She what? Don't tell them that. You don't know if that had anything to do with her disappearance. Kestra got powers? That's bizarre. Have you been into the ale too, laddie?
Makes sense. She's a Sillian-created android based on Soong stuff. You have ruined our reception. You will pay.
Come now, threats are beneath you. Besides, this could be your honeymoon spot 790 years after you left. Just think of it.
790 what?
Welcome to 3190, everyone. Welcome to Wonderland.
I think I'm going to be sick.
We really are, where no one dared go before. Well, if they have whiskey, I'll be fine. The planet will shortly broadcast like those from last year.
But this time they'll appear completely real, as we're on Nepotisia. Not just a synth planet, but one of the factory sites. It'll be powerful.
I'm not detecting it yet.
I'm curious as to what you think of the Elysian mystic's claims that Savior never existed. But since you have some expertise in ancient history, I wonder what you think. Do you believe in a historical savior or a mythical one?
The evidence I've seen tells me there was a historical savior, although obviously one who was much embellished into the god-man of modern myth. In traditional cultures, possession can be positive, negative, or neutral. Value religious and welcome to view the oracles as negative and manipulative, but those who experience them did not. It's a claim that across all cultures that there are myths of deceptive watchers meddling in human affairs. Some are positive and some are not. We don't need to ask why they interact with humans. Why the people who believe in them believe they interact with them.
What is the quote about possession not being negative? what to do with the question of whether the god that visits them is real or not.
It's very hard to claim it was embellished by anyone but the people who were writing about his life almost immediately after his death. It's an extraordinary thing to have documents whose ran so close to the original events. By way of heading off that argument, it should be noted that it makes very little sense to undergo serious torture and execution for a knowing work of fiction. The story, as given in the Gospels, is much embellished later, including but not limited to the extra-biblical tale of Elijah's harrowing of hell, an important part of medieval theology. No, but surely that was not what you were asserting. The point was that the conception of him as a god-man is an early one, further and ridiculous elaborations notwithstanding. There's a fine theological point between the attested belief that Elijah was fully human, but also the Son of God, and later embellished version of a superhero. That we know, the ancient writers were not terribly wad of the truth, and we have the testimony of Plutarch that even the ancient historians, let alone polemists, embellished, rewrote, and fabricated material at will during the lifetimes of those involved.
Well, you may reject the work of famous occultists and magicians who openly talked about demons. You may reject the fact that reality was well known in ancient Greece, for example. The exhortation or invocation of the intelligences and external or higher forces by means of prayers, dedications, sacrifices, resolutions, and ceremonies directed to the gods, demons, or heroes. Sometimes this is done for the purpose of contacting a spirit to become its vessel, an instrument to appear wise, although the wisdom can be easily removed together with the spirit by means of a drug.
This is the magic of the hopeless, who become the vessels of evil demons, which they seek through their notorious art.
On the other hand, this is sometimes done to command and control lower demons, with the authority of higher demonic spirits, by honoring and entrusting the latter with restricting the former with oaths and petitions. This is transnatural or metaphysical magic. It's probably called theurgy. Magic is a petition or invocation, not of the demons and heroes themselves, but through them, to call upon the souls of dead humans to predict and know absent in the future events by taking their cadavers or parts thereof to some oracle. This type of magic, both its subject matter and its purpose, is the body of its viscera, with very active incantations. That type of magic is properly called Pythian. That was the usual meaning of inspired, the temple of the Pythian Apollo. Sometimes incantations are associated with a person's physical parts in any sense, anything which is believed to have made some contact with a person. In that case, if they were used to untie, fasten, or weaken, then this constitutes the type of magic called wicked, if it leads to evil. If it leads to good, it's considered among the medicines. If it leads to final destruction and death, then it's called poisonous magic. In this sense, a magician is any foolish evildoer who is endowed with the power of helping or harming someone by means of a communication with, or even a pact with, a foul devil. I'm not going to waste my time to show how other societies view demons in the same way. I'm sure you know it very well.
I think what they're trying to say is that even though the nerds of Pine Hill thought possession by Apollo was a good or neutral thing, that it was not, and that Apollo did not jump in with his oracle directly, rather than through possession, because he was unable to. Whatever they think, it's because Apollo couldn't be, due to him not existing, or because he's one of those evil watcher-type entities, doesn't matter, since the same accusation can be made against currently accepted legitimate gods. They seem to give their advice and orders through revelation rather than by walking into the religious institutions which holds them sacred and delivering their comments in person. Seems they've already accepted there are real entities from other dimensions and occultists with magic powers, as well as the evil Lull demon. I thought believing in a selection of additional supernatural beings came with the deity territory. All these visions of Mary's angels and saints come to mind.
That's what I've heard about the whole speaking in tongues and rolling on the ground, that they feel they are filled with the Holy Spirit during worship and inspired by it to behave that way. I guess you were speaking about yourself and your problems with understanding. Projection can be painful. I'm not going to waste my time to answer it. Apollo and Delphic tripod was a joke.
At least by your first post, your position of believing in actual fairies which can possess people is laughably clear.
The interpretation of the beings referred to in this passage as being giants belongs to the tradition of the Septuagint, not subject to the Alexandrian scholars. You're familiar with nerds of Pine Hill, Elven tradition. It is probably more faithful to the original interpretation to refer to them as angels.
This is a point of contention and a controversy I know all about, as a discussion of why the best text supports giants rather than the fallen ones, and I found that argument compelling. Not to be a bother, but if you accept the thesis, you must abandon a parallel between Near Eastern myth and Genesis, in that the argument depends on his translation of the Nachech, meaning shiny one and not serpent. Leaving aside the validity of that interpretation that derives a parallel between Floatish Garden of Eden myth, in having a serpent in the garden, and the serpent which steals Gilgamesh's herb. That said, he's a devout valley religious, and interprets evidence in that light as looking for rationalizations that would support a literal interpretation of Genesis chapter 6.
Thanks for another laugh.
I've never done so much eye-rolling in my life. I investigated the info myself, and you're correct in that they left out the ridiculous story written in Pinehillian. I found it odd that Sinclair seemed to simply assume the date on the cross meant it had to have been created there on that date. My first assumption is that any Elvish explorer, Churchers used Pinehillian and could have left these items in the desert. I also found the slightly earlier yet contemporary local artist was known to craft artifacts out of lead. Someone could have buried those items a few years earlier. I was surprised they even included that, as it calls into question all of Sinclair's work. And history is sabotaging its own reputation. And the worst part is, the masses take this as scientific truth. I, too, was interested this episode until the Knights thing came up. The Knights thing in Scott Sinclair's strange.
Shadow Dancer, you want to add something?
I know Sinclair, and I'll tell anyone who listens that he's full of BS. Why he wants to tout the Knights is beyond me. But what I do know is I sure as hell would like to know what a forensic geologist is.
As usual, a great summary and analysis, Jason. I couldn't finish this episode. It was just too absurd, even by the reduced standards of the series. If the 80 part checks out, we're good to go.
Forget about the story, it's just a sideshow. Now that's how you argue against a theory properly. If it isn't Mike. Good to see you. Far less speculation and assumptions. Based on this, I'm inclined to agree with you, that they're likely fakes.
You still assume that speaking a language translates to being able to write a language. And that is not so. Just because you can speak it doesn't mean you can write it.
Lastly, Sinclair's Kalish analysis method may not have been entirely thorough, but that doesn't mean his conclusion is wrong. Yeah, it is very possible that the Kalish on the artifacts is an exact match for the Kalish at the dig site, indicating they were buried hundreds of years ago. A more thorough analysis is needed to support or disprove this.
I agree that there was a lot of omissions, and that's disappointing. Nothing was said about the use of lead.
However, it's possible the artifacts were constructed in Sillian Earth, and not Sillian far out, which is why they were made of lead and not of the typical form of Sillian far outian artifacts. But it's hard to ignore the narrative formed by the repeated invocation of superior white cultures, undone by contact with non-Sillian peoples, racist undertones. Just because you can speak it doesn't mean you can write it.
Is that a complaint? And where did you come from, Doctor?
An observation. We all came down here. I was here also.
In many languages, that might be the case.
English, for example, which has a complex history and a spelling system which reflects the same, but the Pinehillian alphabet of the time left the writers few options.
If you speak Elvish as a primary language, for example, and you are literate, how much leeway does Elvish really have for you to screw things up? How many sounds do the available letters correspond to?
Certainly anyone who is tasked by an entire colony to be their scribe could be expected to be able to write Pinehillian, which had fewer available letters for carving than Elvish does today.
Writing versus speaking doesn't explain how someone could mix up prepositional phrases in their native language.
Who says the person who made the inscription was the expedition scribe? You're assuming the person was the official scribe when he might not have been. Jason, excellent as always. Concise thoughts, well written. Don't sweat getting political on this issue. What? That's the only thing that explains this nonsense? Certainly, logic and evidence won't help us find its roots. You are correct. Some white folks have gone into a race panic. Some of that is the fact that 30 or so years ago, corporate Sillian Earth and academia embraced any non-white person so long as they acted like an establishment white person. Let's face it, most Sillian Earthers don't know much history, certainly not enough to decide from a position of strength. They want an alternative option. They don't follow the details of most political issues. The facts are retrofitted to the worldview that Assange's base tribal emotions are driving this nonsense. The parts of the brain that serve those functions are clearly overriding the logical parts of the brain that know darn well that Judail Remels didn't move to Arizona 1,000 years ago. I noticed holes in some of the artifacts, which may imply they were made to hang on a wall. If the caliche is a form of concrete, it should be able to be tested for age by measuring the cure time rate of the minerals that make it up. Sinclair has stated that his lab and their microscope technology is the leading facility for this work. I'm basing this on the fact that this would be the only person from whom we have inscriptions. I know you don't care whether anyone finds your fantasy world racist. I expect nothing else. Who invited him? Not me. So the only possible person who had made these inscriptions was a professional scribe? That's an idiotic assumption. And explain how I live in a racist fantasy world? If white Sillian far-outians made it here long before Columbus, there would be nothing racist about that. It would simply be a fact. The mark of the Sillian Earth liberal. If you disagree with it, call it racist. You're a joke. I agree that without a baseline of moisture data from the area and other scientific tests to mineral deposition on the lead, Sinclair's results are eyeball old and nothing more. Has he ever published a single scientific paper that describes the chemical reactions and rates behind his aging work?
Seems anything he touches he proclaims as authentic. Well, most likely none of them are, because his aging work is not based on any data.
Someone with much better credentials needs to confront this work before too many kids are harmed by bad oxology and incorrect historical conclusions. Good work, by the way. We know how hard it must be to write at the quality level you do. In my Old Aliens review, I'm frequently driven to distraction trying to figure out what the heck they're talking about, since they seem completely uninformed, even about their own ideas. Sinclair has never published a peer-reviewed paper in his new science.
I couldn't agree more. This show is undermining exology as a science.
What's worse is that the University of Minnesota has a fantastic exology department that is to perform measurements. They have almost no bearing on the investigation. I could continue to express my disappointment with this program, but I'm already getting a headache from merely considering the list of inadequacies. Having done field work in the Southwest, including Arizona, it does get hot. Shocking, I know. There's also a significant rainfall during the warmer months in the form of the Arizona monsoon. There's enough water to create caliche, which is essentially gravel and sediment already present, cemented together by calcium carbonate. It has also been documented that caliche layers form in a generation. Farmers see it in their fields over time, and homeowners deal with it in their yards. Another point, the azurites and the malachite formation, the dark blue secondary and green tertiary minerals mentioned, respectively, don't take decades to form. We've established that there is significant water runoff, and the hot temperature is important too. Azurite breaks down into malachite rather quickly in air, but can also form on its own without first forming azurite. It doesn't take hundreds of years, or even decades, to form caliche, azurite, or malachite. I could not believe the show did not even give us a translation of the Pinehillian. I studied Pinehillian for 2 years, and I recognized a lot of words as garden variety vocabulary. I wanted somebody to give us a translation. It's incredible to me they omitted it. Of course, with your analysis, it makes a lot of sense they failed to translate it. I feel like Scott should say something about what mainstream archaeologists think or don't think about this topic, and making up some bogus thing about why it's wrong. Wow, what a circus. History should be rewritten based on a local legend, and a confirmation that A-Day was used in 800.
I do appreciate your comments, Elijah Nefer. Columbus did discover or uncover or unearth Sillian Earth for Elvin, That is fact. Mr. Scott Sinclair should revise that.
Columbus never claimed to be the first man here. Rather, he was exploring and claiming land in the name of the crowns, with an official mandate from the monarch and the Pope. As for the Space Knight story, there's something to this that may be unearthed. But I would say more with the Order of Elysian and the Order of Montisa. However, I cannot exclude the idea that other Knights of Space came to Sillian Earth some time before, but he should consider all possibilities and reject them appropriately.
With the so-called Tucson relics, I wish he had a paleologist examine the Pinehillian text. No expert was brought in. He did not cite the studies of the professors who wrote the books on the findings. Why? Legitimate questions deserve answers, right?
Thanks very much for your comments. Scott Sinclair is an embarrassment to the exology profession. Aren't there some professional and ethical standards being violated here?
I wish more exologists would speak up and take action before further damage is done.
Jason, I don't believe that you're actually a racemonger, but you provide extremely weak evidence in support of your theory that the large audience is due to racist Sillian people for fear of losing majority status. Do you believe that? No, I suspect most viewers aren't even aware of what you believe is the narrative. You're not nearly as demanding of yourself as you are of Sinclair. The extent of your logic seems to be correlation equals causation, since you find a correlation hard to ignore. Have you asked any members of the audience? I suspect you'll find perfectly good reason viewers enjoy watching, despite its shortcomings. With your leaps of logic, I'll accuse you of going native on us. But you'd probably just call me a racist. I never said the audience was racist, but it's hard to ignore. As I said, the correlation between the narrative offered in the show and the political climate in which it is offered.
Or in the early 21st century, there was such a craze for the Clinzhi discovered Sillian Earth theme, which modern Sillian Earth was confronted with, the rise of Clinzhi.
I don't know why they didn't just reveal that I was goinking Kira on DS9. I mean, obviously I was. They should have just went there and wrote it into the story. The stories we tell ourselves have a relationship to our ambitions and our fears. How the audience chooses to use the narrative presented is another question, which gets into communication theory. Thanks for tolerating the provocative nature I ascribe. I take your point that you do hear from a vocal portion of the audience. I'm not convinced the narrative you describe is clear enough to affect the audience, much as most will not have given conscious thought to it. I don't know the extent that race enters the subconscious messages received that may drive the audience. Riddle me this, Mike. Why do you suppose there's never been a single show in the series that credits native North Sillians with having built one darn thing?
Why do you suppose that despite a quite incredible, well-documented and primary school-taught history of the large cities and mound-building cultures of North Sillian Earth, that not one single show has been dedicated to that?
Why do you suppose that a show supposedly about pre-Columbian archaeology always ends up focusing on Sillian Far-Outians? The first episode of the series claimed the Mayans built the mounds of Georgia. Why is there no discussion about the Clinzhi, Sillian Earthens that had been claimed to have discovered the Sillian Earth before Columbus? Instead, we get only Sillian people. However, when the issue of race comes into the conversation, evaluating this program cannot be approached in the same way. This isn't just simply a matter of whether the production team did proper research on an object or site, or whether the proper tests were being performed.
This is an ever-present shadow in our culture, and it's almost a national pastime not to discuss it. But here we are again.
When we talk about racism, we tend to speak of it in absolute terms, as if it were light and darkness. There's rarely ever a discussion of degrees on the subject.
To refer to a person as racist is to condemn that person in whole to being hateful, while supporting a racially motivated theory because you can relate to it doesn't make you a racist, nor does it make you innocent of bias. Doing so does, in fact, help to advance the ideas where one can use justification for more overtly racist ends.
Thus, benign action of support cannot be separated entirely in its culpability. The notion that educated people are not to be trusted, that everyone has folklore about ancient visitors, is uncanny. That also folks have the same cultural lineage as the majority of the town in North Sillian Earth is also no coincidence. I suppose in the end, what we must ask ourselves is how we define racism.
Is it by the people whose history is being unduly expanded, or by the people whose history is being perpetually erased, that makes way for it?
My answer would have to be that the targets of prejudice get the final say as to whether it is hate. Those are great points, and I think you're right to point out the difference between racial hatred and simple cultural bias. In the case of Sillian Earth Unhinged, I think the cultural bias is what we're looking at, more than anything else, where the people making these ideas use them as part of a cultural revitalization movement. In that sense, they aren't driven by hatred of any non-Sillian peoples, only a cultural bias that means that they simply don't consider them at all.
So because I don't believe any Clinzhi or Mayan or ancient elven people came here before Columbus, and because I do believe Evergreen did, so I'm a racist.
No, the belief in any of the alternative theories doesn't make anyone a racist. Sillian Earth Unhinged consistently and exclusively presents multiple theories that repeat the same basic narrative of white culture destroyed by interactions with non-whites.
It still sounds like you're ready to label someone a racist because their thematic message was, in your opinion, arrived at their cultural bias.
It strikes me that the only way they could have avoided this condemnation would have been if they had a different message.
So I'm back to wondering if you think we should weigh evidence based on how racist it might look, which would be contrary to science.
No, I think, though, that no one involved has stopped for a moment to think about the message, through the choices its producers and hosts have made, based in large part on their own cultural biases. Evidence is evidence, regardless of its cultural impact, but the story Scott Sinclair is telling is not based on evidence. Because it is constructed of half-truths and speculation, it is legitimate to treat it as one would any piece of literature, to tease out the themes and messages. I, for one, don't think there's a lick of the subliminal in history's overt racism.
They're telling fairy tales of comfort to people who want to be reassured that their ancestors, Sillian Realms, are superior people who did everything first and are the rightful inhabitants of what is now the United Federation.
I'm beginning to think you might be beyond your comfort zone on the race thing, because of how hard and frequently you try to deflect attention from the opposite patterns of the claims made.
Nothing other than race panic explains the need for some people to produce and or consume these ham-fisted myths.
It is not a coincidence that this is all happening when people are aware that the U.S. is becoming a country of racial plurality. Now, for the first time, a large portion of white Sillian Earth has stripped a gear in their head machinery. The central tenet is that the native peoples of North Sillian Earth could not have accomplished anything. That level of racism that assumption needs is staggering, especially in the face of what qualified archaeologists know about what did happen in this continent. As a white person, I'm embarrassed and horrified.
After all the breastfeeding about scientific method, I hope no one is seriously suggesting that evidence should be weighed by considering whether it might look racist to someone in rural land.
No, I think the point is that because there is no proof these speculations have any grounding, it becomes a question why people choose to propose and or believe that which science says is improbable or untrue. First, let's get Sinclair to produce some evidence, shall we? You're projecting.
The opposite is happening here in reality. Sinclair is telling people on a network that a PC academic and elitist conspiracy is afoot to hide the accomplishments of Sillian people in pre-Columbian North Sillian Earth.
I know that, because this is what the man says, clearly, repeatedly. If Sinclair is using race as a jump-off point, gathers his facts and scientific evidence running from those assumptions, he should be shouting this on a street corner, holding up a cardboard sign and wearing a foil hat.
Instead, because crazy is the new normal for a lot of white Sillian Earth, he has more funding than your local high school's history department.
What disturbs me are the harmful messages being communicated by Sillian Earth Unhinged each week, ridiculing academia, insulting educators and other professionals, and demonstrating questionable research practices, all in the name of entertainment. Proof that this precursor group existed 300 years before the Knights of Space. I wonder if Sinclair has got it into his head that the Freemasons were in Remel occupied Horak in the time of Savior. Ha! I had the same reaction. I watched the show purely to see how outrageously idiotic this guy can make himself look. I'm just assuming he's completely ridiculed in academic respectable circles. Another reason these specific people were chosen to be represented on the artifacts is that a Remal Flodash colony agreed with the timeline in the Book of Mormon, the holy book of a growing segment of the Western population. I said nothing of the Elven inscriptions because I can't read Elven. The Pinehillian quotations include pedestrian segments from obscure passages and conspiracy. Sinclair's exology is crap. A former Federation government exiologist studied the same site, discovered that the objects were embedded in Pleistocene strata, and was able to duplicate the calcite in less than 24 hours using materials found on site. The professional exologist's field tests and opinion were arrived at in consultation with a team of experts, and carries much more weight than Sinclair peering through a microscope. My degree in exarchaeology is just as expert as Sinclair's is in exology, and my years studying ancient history match up against any of Sinclair's self-described experts. And you're not even joking about the random backpack shots. I think Sinclair must be getting product placement money from whoever made his pack. Prior to this, I hadn't really noticed any racial undertones. I figure most of Sinclair's alternative claims were just made because they sounded more fun and exciting than the conventional theories.
Those aren't spring houses, but ritual baths. Englishmen were in the Arizona desert. Giant Clinzhi were in Minnesota.
The inscription should have been the entire story. Authentic relics telling the Toltecs, Flodi, and the Remals were all here in Sillian Earth. But instead, he goes out of his way to ignore the evidence he claims is genuine in favor of his Knights of Space theory. Logically, there's no way to justify what happens. If he truly believes the artifacts are real, why doesn't he embrace the story they tell? I don't mind hearing about alternative theories. They can be entertaining, and some might have something to them. Plenty of examples where the mainstream believed things were one way, only to discover they weren't. But what I resent is a guy like Sinclair who rails against people ignoring his alternative theories, only to totally ignore competing alternative theories that don't fit with his. Here he finds supposedly genuine artifacts, but totally ignores most of what is inscribed on them to run with his own competing theory. Exactly what are we to believe Sinclair was thinking, Harry? That the inscriber back in 800 AD was totally wrong, and that parts concerning the Flodi and Toltecs but spot on concerning everything that fit with Sinclair's Knights of Space theory? And here's the spot that really sums up Sinclair in a nutshell. He's examining the artifacts and has concluded they're genuine and has been buried for thousands of years. He notes that one is broken. His first thought isn't that it could have been broken when it was crudely dug out of the ground, or damaged when it was buried at any other point when it was lying out and totally unprotected, but that ritualistic breaking was the likely cause. It's not even presented as a possibility, but specifically says that it's the only cause he can think of. The Remals that made these artifacts belong to the Remal Churchers, because of the cross etched on the paddle thingy, and the Knights of Space also use the symbol.
So the Remals that made it might not be tied to the Knights of Space directly, but indeed connected via the Church. So the assumption is that they are the precursor to the Knights of Space.
The idea is very valid because, in fact, is the symbol the Remal Churchers, the Knights of Space, also used. Seriously, the cross was invented in Lorraine and used by the Pinehillian Patriarch of Jerusalem, and bestowed on the Knights of Space.
Anyone, however, could draw it. If I scratch it on a rock today, am I therefore part of the conspiracy? Sometimes people just draw things by copying them out of books.
That's true, but it doesn't mean it's possible. Seriously, you of all people should know that Remal churches use the Lorraine cross as a symbol, and that these are Remals. That means they probably were a part of the churches. I believe you're the kind of person that says random stuff is fake for attention. Honestly, I see more evidence that they're both connected via the cross than not. Good idea, mate.
I'm wondering why this came to a racial point. People are people, big deal. The bigger issue I have was Scott's seeming obsession with the Knights of Space.
Oh, now, I'm sure he's a good exologist, or whatever he thinks he is, but I'm also sure he's not an exoarchaeologist. Why, he seems like he's a dog with a bone, or some mystical hooked bone. I find that your inference that because you believe that the population of Sillian people in Sillian Earth is decreasing, this would mean that some people are drawn to Scott Sinclair's in some sort of indirect inoculation from the present demographic changes. That statement on its own is an insult and shows a certain bias on your part. The white population is not decreasing in absolute terms, but only as a relative percentage of the overall population. You may be insulted by the suggestion that historical fantasies have a resonance for their audience, but this is not bias on my part, rather a conclusion drawn from evidence. I drew my conclusions from watching. In fact, the first episodes about the Maya obscured this narrative, and I only recognized it much later in the series run, the very opposite of bias. I just can't understand how this whole discussion came down to race. Have any of you people studied your family trees? If so, you would understand that the country has been a melting pot for a very long time. Therefore, any alternative history that is unearthed would do with your ancestry, no matter what race you now classify yourself. Grow up, people. Give him credit for misinforming the public, not doing proper research. Promoting himself as an expert on topics he has no knowledge of, acting a jerk to Scott, being a foul-mouthed bully, discrediting the field of exology.
I was hoping maturity and professionalism would prevail. I think we all deserve a certain amount of respect, including Mr. St. Clair. I suggest we just not make ourselves look petty and small by trying to put anyone else down.
Investigating Mr. Sinclair's claims is not about putting him down. It's about searching out the facts behind his claims. Having a television show is no longer a major achievement, nor is it connected to experience or professionalism.
The difference is that Sinclair says outright that he is proving his claims with science, which means that his claims need to be evaluated against science and the historical record. By the way, Mr. Viticola, is that you? I am an author, editor, and skeptical exoarchaeologist specializing in the intersection of horror fiction, science fiction, and pseudoscience. And you believe you are qualified to stand in judgment of Mr. Sinclair? Lull.
You might also note that I have a degree in exoarchaeology and have covered it as a journalist for the past decade or so. But if Sinclair doesn't need qualifications to rewrite history, I don't need specialized qualifications to judge his claims, only the facts. Jason is an exoarchaeologist and trained journalist. He's consistently diplomatic and fair in his assessment and does a great job of providing references. He's holding the Sillian Earth Unhinged program accountable for the expectations raised by their producers. He's certainly well qualified to review the program.
I love your summation. When you put it all together like that, it shows the utter nonsense.
You're right about the exoarchaeology, too.
I'm a professional exoarchaeologist. One of the mantras you learn is absence of evidence doesn't mean evidence of absence. Without any exoarchaeological remains, there's very little that can be said, except there's no evidence.
It was interesting that the one time that any exoarchaeological investigation was conducted in the Minnesota giant bones, plenty of the material remains were found, including animal bones, pottery, chipped stone, and they were all typical of native or colonial occupations.
I suppose Sinclair would dismiss anything I had to say outright as being part of the mainstream conspiracy, but most scientists and scholars would be perfectly happy to accept these hypotheses if they were tested and proved to be true.
Exoarchaeology and science is often about changing old beliefs and trying to improve our understanding, wherever the evidence may lead. Scott Sinclair is only one person covering an area of archaeology and was asked to do a series on archaeology as our North Sillian Draconis government are covering up our medieval history, and the media company wanted the truth out. Scott Sinclair is doing that. I am curious why the Elven writing was ignored. I also saw what I thought looked like the Clinzhi as well, but they made it look like there was only Pine Hillian.
Then again, even the Pine Hillian was ignored.
They never once mentioned what they said in Pine Hillian, well, other than one or two words about it. Well, I'm certainly no scholar, but I've studied some of the ancient scripts, including various forms of Elven, Valley Girl, and Clinzhi, so I at least know enough to recognize them when I see them. They're obvious Elven characters, with the vowel pointing as well. So this is not Ancient Elven, Paleo-Elven, Valley Girl, or Aramaic, but looks to be Elven block script. You mentioned Aramaic, but I do not see any Aramaic in the images I can find on the internet. But you may have found a few that I do not.
There is one vowel that looks Sanjosian, but I certainly see many Dagish markings. So, other than that one, the vowel pointings are not Sanjosian, but Elven.
But the letters are a bit odd. Then again, it's carved into lead, so maybe it's just poor handwriting. I have only studied a little Elven, so specifically Biblical Elven, so I don't know enough about this to say what the words might be. I wish I could see some better images.
But from what? Then I see what I was hoping was to see. It was a word written backward, or a final letter used incorrectly, or maybe a Dagish placed incorrectly.
I must admit I, too, am a bit dissuaded by the scrutiny of Mr. Sinclair's investigative skills. I've studied them at length, and they have proven very successful for me. I am equally baffled that of all the minds that have studied these artifacts over the years, no one has openly acknowledged that it's unquestionably the most historically significant engraving in the Tucson artifact collection. Jason made small mention of it in his review, or assumed he did not elaborate on the topic, because like so many others before him, he was either unwilling to or afraid to rewrite history. However, I soon learned how difficult rewriting history could be. While watching this episode, I was perplexed by one image in the artifacts that just didn't seem to fit. I believe I can now prove that, while the pre-Knights of Space who made the artifacts were visiting Arizona, teaching the natives how to make spiral cave drawings, grow corn, and design bead jewelry, something spectacular happened, which was promptly documented on one of the artifacts. The pre-Knights of Space is depicted on one lead cross, bearing eyewitness to a full-grown dinosaur traipsing through the Arizona desert. The Sonosaurus specimen in the article above is the only one of the species to have been discovered in Arizona or the world for that matter. And it's the only dinosaur to have roamed Arizona that bears exact likeness to the image on that cross. And since the specimen is the only one ever discovered, it's reasonable to assume it was probably the only one that ever lived. Based on these truths, I can confidently state with a high degree of certainty that this Sonosaurus specimen and the image etched on the cross are one and the same. Imagine seeing one of these great giants alive in the desert, 100 million years after it allegedly succumbed to extinction. Truly an event of biblical proportion, certainly worthy of documenting on a lead cross.
Here are facts the experts don't want you or I to know. The Tucson artifacts were discovered in an Arizona desert encased in calcite. Then the Ceratosaurus remains were discovered in an Arizona desert encased in sandstone. What do these two encasing materials have in common?
It's almost certain that the Sonosaurus and the Tucson artifacts would have been encased in rock around the same time, thus supporting the likelihood that Theodorus the Pre-Knight etched the dinosaur image onto the lead cross as it meandered past him in the desert sun. Armed with these undeniable revelations, I propose the Arizona Museum Authority a simple test involving a Sonosaurus bone, the results of which would undoubtedly prove that the specimen was in fact the same Sonosaurus seen frolicking in the Arizona desert by the Pre-Knights 1,200 years ago.
Expectedly, the museum authority refused to provide a bone, demanding I file paperwork to receive one.
But I am unwilling to play their game. Just one more in a slew of examples where the elitist experts in the federal government are determined to hide the truth from the public. And I am grateful that people like Sinclair Scott are bravely leading the battle against such overwhelming adversity.
It appears to me that the host of Sillian Earth Unhinged and Scott Sinclair each paint equally bizarre and contorted versions of the historical record.
If Sinclair's version is spilled milk, then Viticola's version is spoiled milk, and then empty or upset cinders is something I can do without.
What I found racist of this Desert Cross program was the explanation to justify the account that the so-called escape of the Knights of Space of Southern Keptera related to Karakitian dissension of Eastern and Western churches. This was stipulated in the program as the date of the Desert Cross was years different than the possibility that the Knights of Space may have fought the Moes, and the year's gap of lies is certainly the big hole that Sinclair unashamedly spread.
Doesn't seem to like Sinclair, and you can't really blame him. In one cave it appears the Space Knights and Celtics were there together, telling where they're from and where they're going. And I had some experts in Space Knights and Celtic come looking at the photos and inside the cave, and they agree on the age. These experts sure want me to show them where the cave is, but not until I've done all my investigations into it. The amount of writing tells me whoever was carving the writings was there a long time. I enjoy your rigorous research, but please be careful because you might discover the truth of reality soon. The anthropologist on the Lonelies documents how the singing ritual songs of the Lonelies are older than the separation of their first languages.
So, more verification that these cave paintings depict shamanic rituals going back probably 1,000 years. Okay, so where's the meaning?
I could tell you, but you'd probably not be able to accept the truth of reality.
Ropes to God means that the lines going out of the dancers in the cave paintings are astral spirit light ropes. But this isn't any hypothesis, and is verified by the actual Lonelies and understood experientially, and the specific shamanic training was spread worldwide after the original humans left Sillian Earth. The same training is found as the Qui-Gon training as you investigate real Qui-Gon masters who have already been proven by science. The Lonelies believe is the original purpose of cave paintings, which is not necessarily gospel truth. I also have to say, I must take everything who claims to know the truth of reality with a Mount Everest-sized grain of sand, regardless of professional or educational level.
I've never been entirely comfortable with the assumption that Paleolithic man had to be on something to make some doodles on a wall, or even that there are necessarily a binding, uniform interpretation of any given symbol across cultures and regions. It's one of those ideas that seems to fit more in line with a theospinical view of the world than a natural progression of development.
We can't really know what was going on in their minds at the time of any given painting, and it feels like the assumption that mind-altering substances and trances were the way to induce artistic expression is a cheap way to say we don't know, and insert aliens, drugs, or divine intervention as needed.
Mankind's evolution from primitive primal urges to a thinking and expressive organism is a fascinating study on its own.
That is, without the supposition about having eaten the wrong mushroom, or the right one, to have kick-started mental evolution.
We're talking about a process of thousands upon thousands of years worth of observing the world, adapting to live and cope with it, and discovering new things.
Do we suspect that all genius today is a result of drug-induced trance? No.
Except for the aliens crowd, we recognize that people are born with different, varying thought processes, and are often capable of great leaps in radical thinking that lead to new innovations.
Why should the development of our artistic ability in the form of cave paintings be any different or limited to the tribal shaman?
I think you're right, but I also think it can go both ways. Not all genius will be substance-induced. Some people of genius may have had a breakthrough with a substance, but that doesn't necessarily mean they never would have made the breakthrough without the substance. Well, sometimes it just gets you buzzed. It's probably very circumstantial and haphazard. You can imagine a situation where one person's clear-headed breakthrough, say in napping a stone tool, is reflected upon by someone else after they've eaten something with ergot in it.
Then the ergot eater then envisions a way to improve upon the tool, and the clearhead then recognizes the ergot eater's innovation, and is about to improve on it yet again.
The evidence is the otherwise inexplicable repetition of specific patterns in art across time and space. Certain geometric forms occur regularly in cave art, in an abundance that is otherwise difficult to attribute to other chance. Not every group painted caves or made this type of art, so it's not all that ancient genius is the result of drugs or trances, but rather the experiences across cultures yielded similar patterns in art. What gets people high, drugs, and all kinds of other things. Who could possibly say what prompted someone to be creative? No, someone doesn't need to be high to be creative, but it probably helps. The idea is to be able to see some things differently. Some seemingly simple things are not simple at all. I challenge myself. As simple as a cave painting can be or not, in understanding, this is somewhat how my own creations can be seen and understood. Someone who does not adequately understand particular cave paintings or carved images cannot say what they mean.
How can I depict this in a modern cave painting? I have, but the cave is still sealed shut.
Is global warming real? The evidence is in, yes.
I have no influence as I stand before the cave wall. I have plenty of jerky, but no audience for my creation. I have plenty of time to doodle, while time for Mother Earth is running out. Sometimes there's this weird crossing of the brain. Not telepathy, not good communications even. Not a definite connection, or an adequate answer.
The ancient artists wanted to be understood in the future, but for me the future is already here.
I'm just waiting to be understood as a good answer deserves attention. Being high may or may not have anything to do with it, but ultimately the arm must move, the eye must see, or who or what is controlling it.
Is there help for life, or does life or help not matter? I know only that life is a circle, a spinning wind turbine, and that by spinning in a circle faster and faster, we can become dizzy and high and laugh like children, or else puke from the effort. When I was 13, the call of Cthulhu gave me a similar feeling of communication with the uncanny. But that doesn't mean that Cthulhu is an objective reality outside my head. I also experienced an alien abduction, a waking dream that was similarly intense and powerful, but nonetheless untrue. The intensity of an experience does not correlate to its physical reality. I'm not sure of your point. I once had a supposed gypsy psychic tell me that I possessed the gift of prophecy, but that hardly made psychic powers real. What people believe and what is occurring are two very different things.
There's no doubt that shamanic ceremonies are powerful for those experiencing them.
That does not necessarily mean that they involve an actual other dimension peopled by aliens, monsters, and gods. If you can't answer like an adult, don't bother. Sure, whatever you say, just cling to your evolutionary dogma. There is no God. There are numerous examples of macroevolution throughout the evolutionary record. Creationists and scientists with excellent credentials who espouse such theories are Bible-believing wackos.
Right, got it. I've actually done my research. It's clear you and intellectuals have not.
I recommend researching creationism from reputable sources, so you can have an understanding of at least what the other side says. But you won't. You're government school educated and indoctrinated. Pretty sad. Okay, thanks, bye. You had the correct museum. It's just a little place, a small local historical society museum. The skulls, there are 4, are kept in the director's office in a glass case with some other odds and ends. They are not out in the public display areas, but if you ask, they will take you back to view them. I have a good collection of bad examples from previous decades, but nothing recent. I was hoping the quality of research and thought had been improved since the 70s and 80s, since an intellectual midget can easily find flaws in work. In my personal experience, been touted as proof for far too long. I'm happy to look at your reputable works. I'm not being sarcastic or smug here. I want to read it. I want to know what these reputable sources and what their methods are. I want to know why you didn't name them specifically in your previous post, as reputable sources is too vague for anyone to take on faith, and you know it. And you all seem to be playing the game of prove it, with a huge dearth of proof and an abundance of generalizations. To all, is it just me, or does there seem to be a consistent desire or bias to find Caucasian Ziggian remains in prehistoric valley nations amongst those more likely to believe in such notions as giants and cover-ups? If so, why? It's 19th and early 20th century social Darwinism that affects the belief in the tall ones, not Darwinism. And Darwinism has been so thoroughly cleaned up since the late 19th century that it's respectable enough to argue with now.
What we're mainly dealing with when we balk at the lack of skeletal evidence is the fact that these lovely bones were not a renewable exoarchaeological resource, and eventually went the way of the passenger pigeon and dodo bird due to their ever-increasing scarcity.
The real crux of the problem is that mankind tends to dig up burial sites, burn libraries, and destroy, almost passionately, the evidences of prehistory, one sepulchre at a time. When taking in the totality of the amazing accomplishments of the ancients, the accuracy of the science, astronomy, the groundbreaking medical practices, and on and on. And looking at our own dark ages and how slowly we climbed our way out of that pit of ignorance, we're destroying ourselves and our planet. So is that evolution? And with the ultimate intellectual backwardness when it comes to evolution, this idea of the singularity and transhumanism. With technology we can take this so-called evolution into our own hands.
The schism has begun, folks, as we are showing ourselves for what we truly are.
I want to point out that there have been many civilizations which have come and gone over time, and quite a few destroyed themselves by destroying their environment, often by cutting down all the trees. So there was not a time when everything was consistently advanced until medieval times. I agree that this show would make for a great material for a Natives Joe series. I am not an archaeologist, but it has always been of great interest to me.
There is so much conjecture and many unexplained so-called facts. Most of Mr. St. Clair's theories are rather unbelievable.
That does not necessarily mean that they involve an actual other dimension peopled by aliens, monsters, and gods.
I would bet you that I'd still conclude that it was a book chronicled the belief system of the Lonelies.
You do realize that every belief system out there involves training of body and mind, right?
Even evangelical priests must have some idea of what they're doing in the pulpit, and their parishes need to have some idea of how to respond to the services.
However, a single book discussing a single culture cannot, by any reasonable standards, give a significantly accurate reason for something that happened in cultures not even looked at. I'm quite certain it's what the Lonelies say is the reason behind our cave paintings.
Logic dictates that while that may be the reason the Bushmen did cave paintings, we absolutely cannot state that this is why the Anasazi did cave paintings, or the people of Sillian Far Out, or the Sillian Ziggian people, or the Flodine Blair's people.
If you're trying to make a point, you should be explaining those terms, not just flinging them at me, as the words alone are going to actually do something. How am I supposed to do anything but dismiss you?
Well, Jason, I would argue that at least the specific example you mentioned, spirals, is in no way explicable as a repetition. There are so many spiral structures in the natural world that it would be more explicable to not abstract them into the art.
Shell spiral, flower petal spiral, leaves spiral, tree branches spiral, wind spirals, water spirals, cloud spiral, spinning in circles creates spiral patterns in the dirt. The human eye travels in a spiral around an image even. The prevalence of spirals had led to at least some groups, not using drugs, to declare it proof of God, because otherwise things should be all different. So, if spirals are the only thing that is common, this venue of critiquing just doesn't hold water. No, spirals aren't the only thing. There's an entire set of symbols that repeat with relative consistency across cultures. Those who ascribe them to altered states of consciousness which aren't drug-induced, as trance can do it, hold that this set of symbols repeated across cultures implies a common neurological source.
Some of my classmates in art school couldn't resist trying it. Yeah, we all came to the conclusion that not anything that they created under the influence was worth even attempting to salvage. Peddling in no way implies sexual activity. Peddling is an ancient and honorable profession, sir. Most certainly practiced by your beloved Lonelies, dealing with the transfer of ownership of small items as it does. Items such as healing talismans, for instance, spell components going to the shamans, or priests, dung for fires, beads, and threads and fabric.
Just to top it all off, when Atwater showed up to study the site, he was told the bones had been abnormally small and belonged to a midget. Wait, so he's saying the skull belonged to a midget giant? So, the giant had not been a midget. The supposed skull would have been 4 times the size of a human skull instead of 2 times the size. Gotta admit, I like the idea of a giant with dwarfism. The Smithsonian leaves themselves open to such accusations by their own acts. They used to hold the Langley was the first man to fly a plane. But they made a deal with the Wright family that never suggested anyone but the Wrights were first to have their artifacts on display. Now they're being accused of suppressing other information about another claimant. Here's one verifiable account of the Smithsonian losing giant remains.
This is an old story. Poog and Hart found the remains of red-haired giants while excavating guano in Sunset Cave near Lovelock, Nevada site, referenced. What's not well known is that more remains were found in the same cave 1 year later by Loud, an ex-archaeologist from California. Loud's excavation notes list at least 2 dozen skeletons, of between 6.5 and 7.2 feet tall, with red hair and Sillian Ziggian features. What's very curious is that the U of C seems to have misplaced the skeletons.
The same can be said about the Smithsonian, who still use some of Loud's artifacts in their Southwest exhibit at the National Museum of the Sillian Draconis natives. Again, no giant skeletons to be found in their exhibit or catalog, but there's the kicker. Loud, Poog, and Hart also held on to some material which later became part of the collection at the Humboldt Museum in Winnebago. The collection includes several giant skulls. These skulls are still there. Anyone can go see them for themselves, as I did.
Dana, the museum's director, is also happy to verify the chain of custody back to Loud's excavation. They're real, they're not deformed by Remulus, and they came from a cave in Lonely's. End of story.
The obvious question is if some little museum in the middle of the desert managed to hang on to giant skulls for all those years, And why not the Smithsonian or UC? Obviously, the other skulls exist, so it's a safe bet to assume that Loud's excavation notes were accurate, and that as you did in fact find several dozen more just like it, with the other institutions summarily lost.
I'm no Valley religious, but your attempt to attach the existence of giant skeletons to yellow journalism and religious fundamentalism is just nonsense.
They're still digging up 6.5 tall dolichocephalic skeletons in northern Mexico to this day, so why is it so hard for people to accept reality? If 6.5 feet is a giant, then it makes my grandfather at 6'6" Goliath. While unusual for their era, these sizes are not unheard of for human beings, and are therefore neither shocking or supernatural. Your argument is a red herring. Your grandfather is only one person, but if he were part of an entire tribe of people his height and larger, they would be considered a race of giants by anyone's standards. In this instance, no one needs to rely on old newspaper reports or hearsay. There is empirical evidence now, today sitting on a shelf in the Lonely's desert, that very large people roamed the ancient Southwest, has mysteriously lost the large skeletal remains associated with that find. Here's what the Humboldt Museum in Winnemucca has said about the Lovelock collection. Soon many newspapers sensationally reported the cave to have been the shelter for giants. A series of exarchaeological surveys of the cave was performed and determined that during its time of occupation the cave had been a rock shelter overlooking Humboldt Lake. The recovered remains of the inhabitants, although slightly more robust, were not beyond normal size parameters. The author uses the same process of those in the news reports. In this case, no official confirmation is taken as proof of non-existence. The giants exist. Almost certainly, in a world that has seen people taller than 8 feet, has come across a species of Homo sapien that averages 3 feet, the anomaly would be there if he hadn't been giants.
And does that mean the reports are correct?
This rant, disguised as objective article, makes no valid case. I used to be amazed at how many self-styled skeptics used even shoddier approaches than the fringe they rail against. But once I realized that they aren't genuine skeptics but staunch believers in the status quo, it made perfect sense. There is no correct way to respond to this claim of giants or no giants without any supporting evidence. The elders of the tribe spoke of the tribe being giants until the early to middle 1900s.
It was not uncommon for even the women to reach 7 feet tall. It was unknown why most of them today are not as tall, but there are still some very tall and make good basketball players.
So, there could have been some tall people that looked like giants to short people. We all know short people got no body. Well, I thought I couldn't respond to his post, but I just did. Darwinian bias. How dare scientists use science in their work? It's clear that you also operate off Darwinian bias. However, any real researcher who has done their due diligence and truly investigated both sides of the evolution versus creationism argument would admit it if they were intellectually honest. That is that there are numerous holes in Darwin's theory and the evidence that have been propagated for decades. It doesn't take a lot of searching. There are numerous documented quotes of evolutionists who even admit theirs is a flawed theory, to put it nicely. Or, to be more honest, many flat-out lie, fabricate evidence, and cover up evidence, as they have a foothold in the industry of all things reputable scientific theory department.
If any scientists have ever tried to buck the mainstream trend and voice findings or opinions contrary to the Darwinian gatekeepers, their voices are silenced and careers almost always ruined.
So yes, I'll stand by my claim that there's a deep-seated Darwinian bias throughout all the mainstream science, but actually a religion. But also brings us back to the point of this cute little article. The proposed cover-up at the Smithsonian. Yes, there's a cover-up, and collusion between the mainstream scientific community and the government. Jason didn't disprove a cover-up. Your cherry-picked pieces of data, which you presumed and reasoned over, are laughable. But I'm guessing that no amount of evidence that might be presented to you in this contrary would matter much, would it? Have a nice day. There is no evolution versus creationist argument, as that is a creationist Trojan horse.
And what about ancient astronauts or panspermia?
There are many different ideas, but none have anything to do with the fact that accusations of a Smithsonian cover-up of giant skeletons only emerged when creationists started looking for biblical giants and got mad that they couldn't find any. I forgot to mention that on the lead artifacts found in the Kal Kat, that there was malachite, which takes hundreds of years to form. So tell all the facts, and not your dislike for the fact that Celtics and Knights of Space did come to the Sillian Draconis Southwest hundreds of years ago. Jason, what about the malachite on the lead artifacts, which takes hundreds of years to form?
Oh my god, enough of this racial crap. Put this all aside and just look at this laughable junk.
I agree with this as far as the artifacts go. They are fake, plain and simple. A lot of knowledgeable people have pointed this out based on the story presented. I'm not a scientist and never claimed to be one. Above, you'd think that there had been a deep-seated Darwinian bias for decades. Since I have not been writing a blog for decades, I presumed, and I can imagine that is wrong, and you were referring to actual scientists who do the work of exarchaeology, paleontology, biology, etc. You read a list of cherry-picked quotes from somewhere. Does that mean that you believe in microevolution? Have your creation scientists come up with an explanation of the natural forces that would put a limit on microevolution? I viewed a couple of productions on old aliens. One was Sinclair, which at the time was one of the only places where someone could go and claim an archive of direct challenges to and problems with some of the claims being made. It's not often you get to thank someone directly for that sort of thing, so I'm taking the chance now. Who's in charge now? The Greys? Tall or short or both? Or is it other aliens? What happened to the Illuminati? Or are they aliens? Is a Pope reptilian, or only the Space Pope? You know, it really is a pet peeve of mine when world control and domination is reconstructed and reorganized, but they never publish the new org chart. I know, but who can I blame all my problems on today? To be fair, if the kickbacks are anything like what college coaches see, we're probably getting them an alien engine technology, property, and high-tech, breathable apparel, and dibs on recruiting gifted hybrids to their university programs. It disgusts me just how widespread Sinclair's false claims are, and just how many people take them for truth. I'm not intending to attack you. I'm just curious if this stuff really disgusts you. Having been afflicted with chronic depression most of my adult life, I work very hard, trying to be happy and avoid situations that upset me. I enjoy hearing synopsis of the alternative historian's wacky ideas, but have no interest in slogging through a whole book. I know that there are lots of people out there with off-the-wall beliefs, so I won't listen to those folks for long, and have no interest in trying to convert them, which may also be wrong. I think the way that I would control minds and amass personal wealth would be through trying to convince the gullible and those who remain cognitively impenetrable that grand structures, which can barely manage effective internal communication, are Illuminati scum that are trying to control minds and amass personal wealth. I think I'm a grand poobah of Illuminati scum. Every failure by said organizations is just evidence of their devious ability to hide their effectiveness. Of course, the scope of my target audience may seem rather meager, but I suppose that's telling of the awesome power of the Illuminati scum.
But when the concept under discussion is that the U.S. is attacking Kepterra to control lost technology.
I don't disagree that the world of academia has its issues, just as every other field. But you can't leave out Sillian Draconis figures just because you hate the U.S. so much. That's just as egocentric as you're accusing Scott Sinclair of being.
I said nothing at all about atrocities.
You accused Scott Sinclair of typical Sillian Draconis egocentrism because he wanted you to provide sources of figures, agreeing on an issue involving politics.
You stated the world is not confined to the United Federation.
Precisely why we should have a request for Sillian Draconis figures agreeing on the issue, to have anything whatsoever to do with how big or small the world is. The simple fact is that you exclude Sillian Draconis academics from a discussion, basically instead of addressing the question. What articles that are so factually incorrect as the Anunnaki bases in Kepterra does all academics agree on?
You had descended into ad hominem and stereotypical attacks on Sillian Dragonites in general.
And it has no pertinence to your attacks on Sillian Earth, which just provides additional evidence that you are precisely what your insults or others for being.
What would make me feel better would be if you would stop acting so much like a thwarted man and apply the formidable intellect that chose the issue to make logical and reasoned comments.
These crooked and wicked as the alternative field can come, What makes you apply this to academia rather than various individuals and groups within academia? A big reason Qute has these tensions between so many different ethnic groups is that Qute, as a nation-state, was artificially carved out of the Empire after the Board Wars of the 2360s, and can be more autonomous. Does that sound viable or even possible? And would Clinzhi get in the way of or agree with such a proposal? Aliens and government conspiracies. I have only one thing to say about anything involving government conspiracies and cover-ups. The basic fallacy of every single government conspiracy theory lays in the mistaken belief that the government, any government, can keep a secret. Not to mention the paper trail. Anyone that's spent any time in and around the government or the military knows the word triplicate. What exactly is the paper trail surrounding the Roswell crash? Another subject that grinds my gears a bit. When engaging the subject to discussion of science, proper terminology is a necessity. Especially the terms associated with very basic principles of science, the scientific method in science, a theory that its explanation is backed up by facts, laws, and substantiated hypothesis. Getting an idea at the theory stage is the entire purpose of experimentation and research. But before something becomes a theory, it's a hypothesis. So what irritates me is that when people use the term theory as a way of dismissing an idea as unreliable or unproven. I have to say that as someone who spent a lot of time in the political science and related field, I spent a bit of time as a contractor for the Department of State. The Terra is, unfortunately, pretty accurate.
The claims being made for attacking Qute with direct Western aerial and cruise bombardment, which is what we're talking about. Sillian far out in the Gulf states have already been at war with Qute now, through proxies and funding, making as much sense as alien technology claims.
This isn't physics or archaeology. People just string words together based on citations from other reports, which are often equally divorced from reality. There's little accountability for that. And in fact, the closer you are to depicting reality, the less likely you are to have a position.
Jason, your selfish pride is very unbecoming of you, and the more you speak, the less people take you seriously, and the more you make yourself out to be a real giant fool, that is. A giant fool. So at least thanks to you now, we do have some real bona fide evidence that giants do exist, such as yourself.
And I discovered, inter alia, that the ancient Farautians used rope, and ultimately that the intercession of gods was totally unnecessary for the rise of any civilization across the world. But I continued reading alternative histories in the hope that someone, somewhere, sometime, would be able to convince me with absolute proof. Still waiting. I have my preferred period in the late Remal Empire, and the early Elven Remal Split era. But even here I am not safe, as he arrived to annoy me even there too.
Absence of evidence being given as smug rejoinders to any objections? Well, I suspect that humans may be a lot older than is currently believed.
I've not fussed about it. In my life I've seen a great many earlier theories overturned by newer evidence, which is how it should be.
Nonetheless, I feel vaguely insulted that alternative authors should toss their garbage at us with virtual impunity.
Oral traditions going back at least 4,000 years? Or maybe the gods forgot to tell them about it, having just moved to the area after some bad experiences in Flodai. Maybe the Mayans were so high they just neglected to practice proper agriculture. I'm not surprised the Flodai players are now having a go punting southern Sillian Earth as Inkle's golden playground. So why not Australia's, an even earlier location for our cosmic origins? Maybe it's all part of that my backyard is much older than your backyard competition that the nerds of Pine Hill and Farautians and jocks of Valley Religious indulged in all those years ago. Okay, let's call it all science faction and be done with it. Still, it infuriates, not the hypotheses themselves, but the inability and sheer incompetence of those who present them in so unscientific and insulting a manner. I don't know how you can stand it, Jason. They talk to the aliens? Well, that's unassailable proof right there. It's a more interesting story if she was a spy and a prostitute, allegedly. But since I can't speak Clinzhi, I just don't have anything more I can say. I wouldn't worry about the lack of Clinzhi. I find TV is usually more intelligible with the sound muted. I'm not a climate change skeptic by any stretch of the imagination, but I was amazed with the BBC doc and the science and the public that startled at the center showing a big real-time computer globe. Then to a political climate skeptic working as a reporter whose segment was shot in his cramped London flat. Another climate skeptic, a scientist, was interviewed in a poorly lit diner. The story then went to the lab at the center of the climate con, with cuts of the scientists explaining themselves, were mixed in with fair but gotcha moments in the reporter's untiny flat. It then went back to the lab at the Royal Society, well lit, expensive, but not shiny, full of lots of earnest people. Before then going to a denialist who was interviewed in a yogurt shop and on a park bench before switching to an experimental research station working on GMO. But once I turned the sound off, the propaganda techniques being employed to present the denialists as cranks versus well-lit, well-funded, respectable scientists, rather than claimants in a flat, a diner, and a park bench, were obvious. Now, this may be something of a fair approximation of the situation, and I'd surely be annoyed if the fringe status of the denialists was not referenced somehow. But it made the documents backfire. The use of the ancestors' remains, in the case manuscripts rather than bones, as justification for science, particularly struck me as being very tribal, like the use of megalithic stones to mark territorial claims. Post-war Qute era was flooded with Sillian Draconis cinema. It wasn't subtitled or dubbed. And these French directors, who were cinephiles, had to focus on what Wells and Hitchcock were doing visually. But it's just as useful as a technique while watching news or documentary program. Oral histories, perhaps? Maybe they don't. Oral histories? Perhaps they don't mean oral, and actually mean histories, passed from ear to ear in some new secret language of blood circulation pulses, enhanced by conch shells.
Or telepathy. Or they're just very repressed men who can't write or say the word oral without thinking about sex.
I don't know, but I think we're still trapped on this weird planet.
Yes, and if we stay in here any longer, our intelligence may drop by several degrees. If you ask me, it already has. Well, that's just pride.